Ionescu. She got it. And Stewart doing it all.
That is what makes her special.
Hey Liberty fans, welcome back to Liberty FM. It's great to be back. It's been a little while since our last episode. Life has kept us away from the microphone for a few weeks, but we're excited to be back because there's been so much happening with this New York Liberty team. First of all, thank you to everyone who has continued listening and supporting the podcast while we've been away. We truly appreciate it. And since our last episode, the Liberty have experienced quite a roller coaster. When we last recorded, the team was in the middle of a three-game home losing streak after losses against the Golden State Valkyries, an up-and-coming Dallas Wings team, and perhaps most surprisingly, the Portland Fire, one of the league's expansion teams. Since then, however, the Liberty have responded brilliantly, putting together an 8-game winning streak that earned them a place in next week's Commissioner's Cup final against the Las Vegas Aces. You might think that everything has been smooth sailing since then, but that wouldn't be this Liberty team. There have still been plenty of ups and downs, and today we're going to break down what has changed, what's working, what still concerns me, where this team stands heading into one of the biggest stretches of the season. Looking back at that 8-game winning streak, I really think the turning point came during the third quarter of that first game against the Phoenix Mercury. The Liberty were trailing, nothing seemed to be working, and Chris DeMarco called a timeout. From everything we could see, he challenged the team to raise its defensive intensity. That timeout completely changed the mentality of the group. What really stood out wasn't necessarily an offensive adjustment. It was the fact that the Liberty began mixing up their defensive coverages by introducing two schemes we had not seen much from them this season, a full court press and a 2-3 zone. The full court press immediately made the Liberty much more disruptive. Instead of allowing Phoenix to comfortably initiate its offense, New York began forcing the Mercury to work much harder just to get into their sets. That extra pressure generated several turnovers and completely changed the rhythm of the game. The other major adjustment was the implementation of the 2-3 zone. Of course, having players like Leonie Fibish and Benajah Hamilton back in the lineup make this type of defense much easier to execute. When you can put players like Stewie and Leonie Fibish at the top of the zone, their length becomes an enormous weapon. They clog passing lanes, contest shooters, and make life extremely difficult for teams that aren't particularly dangerous from three-point range. Those two defensive schemes, the full court press and the 2-3 zone, became the foundation of the Liberty's defensive identity throughout that 8-game winning streak, and the results spoke for themselves. One of the biggest advantages of playing zone is that it can help protect players who may struggle in one-on-one perimeter defense. Instead of constantly asking defenders to win individual matchups, the responsibility shifts towards collective positioning, communication, and teamwork. Everyone has to move together. Of course, that also becomes the biggest challenge. A successful zone defense requires constant communication. Every rotation has to be timed perfectly because the moment one player leaves an area to help, someone else has to rotate beyond her and fill that space. If those rotations are late, even by half a second, good offensive teams will find open player. There's also an important difference between playing zone in Europe and the WNBA. In FIBA basketball, the center can essentially remain in the paint as long as necessary. In the WNBA, however, the defensive 3-second rule changes everything. Players like Jonquel Jones cannot simply camp in the lane. They constantly have to step in and out of the paint to avoid the defensive 3-second violation. That naturally opens small gaps around the basket, meaning the two defenders alongside the center have to cover much more ground than they would in Europe. That's why communication becomes absolutely critical. The best way to attack a zone is to move the basketball quickly. You want to force defenders to rotate, attack the seams between defenders, collapse the defense, and then find the open teammate. When opponents move the ball well enough, even the best zone can begin to break down. But when the Liberty communicated well, stayed connected, and used their incredible length, the results were outstanding throughout that winning streak. It certainly helped that many of the teams they faced were elite three-point shooting teams, like Phoenix, Connecticut, Washington. Those teams don't constantly punish you from deep. What impressed me, though, was seeing these defensive schemes remain effective against teams like the Indiana Fever and the Toronto Tempo, two teams that rely much more heavily on perimeter shooting and three-point volume. Obviously, opposing coaches are going to adjust. Every game has more film. Scouting reports became more detailed. Eventually, teams began identifying the weaknesses with your defensive system. And I think we started seeing that during the Liberty's 86-83 home loss to the Washington Mystics. Players like Shakira Austin and Kiki Iriafen did an excellent job attacking the soft spots in the zone. Instead of settling for contested jump shots, they constantly found openings around the free throw line and inside the paint, exactly where you want to attack a 2-free zone. Sonia Citron also did a great job recognizing those gaps and making quick decisions before the defense had time to rotate. That's always going to be the challenge with zone defense. Against teams that don't shoot particularly well, it can completely disrupt an offense. But against teams with smart guards, good interior passing, and versatile post players, it becomes a much more vulnerable. Even so, I think sometimes as Liberty fans, we focus a little too much on negatives because despite those concerns, there were plenty of positives during this stretch, especially offensively. While the defensive adjustments have understandably received a lot of attention, I think one of the biggest positives during this winning streak has actually been what Chris DeMarco has brought offensively. One of my biggest criticisms of the Liberty last season was that at times the offense became far too predictable. Too often we would see players holding the ball, relying on isolation, or waiting for Stewie to create something out of nothing. This season the offense has much more movement. There's far more cutting, more off-ball screens, more hands-off, and much better spacing overall. When you have versatile players like Stewie, JJ, and Phoebish and Satu Sabali, it makes perfect sense to build an offense around constant movement rather than static possessions. I think we've all seen this season that Stewie is at her best when she's attacking the defense rather than posting up with her back to the basket for 10 seconds. You want her catching the ball on the move. You want her coming off stagger screens. You want her using dribble hands off. You want her attacking mismatches before the defense has time to get set. When she's able to get downhill from the perimeter, she's nearly impossible to stop. She can finish at the rim, pull up from mid-range, draw help defenders, and create open shots for her teammates. That's why I think Chris DeMarco has really helped maximize her strength. Instead of asking Stewie to bail the offense out every possession, he's put her in position where she can attack naturally within the flow of the offense. For me, that's been one of the biggest offensive improvements compared to last season. Another player who deserves a tremendous amount of credit is Pauline Astier. I think it's fair to say she's exceeded almost everyone's expectations. We all knew the Liberty was signing a talented point guard with a very high basketball IQ. What we didn't know was just how important she was going to become this early in the season. With Sabrina Ionescu sidelined for an extended period of time, the Liberty certainly needed someone to stabilize the offense. Pauline stepped into that role remarkably well. The thing that impressed me the most is her first step. She's incredibly quick. Time and time again, defenders have struggled to stay in front of her. Once she gets that initial advantage, she's very good at getting downhill and forcing the defense to react. Against Indiana, she took advantage of Caitlin Clark, who was dealing with foul trouble and isn't necessarily known as an elite perimeter defender. Pauline attacked her relentlessly and constantly got into the paint. But it wasn't just Indiana. She had success against players like Jordan Canada with Atlanta or Monica Koamakani with Phoenix as well. The speed has translated immediately to the WNBA. Perhaps even more impressive is how fearless she's been. Sometimes international players need several months before they become comfortable in this league. Pauline has looked confident from day one. I think a lot of that comes from her basketball IQ. She rarely looks rushed, she understands tempo, she understands spacing, and she constantly makes the simple play. Those qualities have allowed her transition to the W to be much smoother than many people expected. Another aspect of her game that has really stood out is her passing. One thing she's done exceptionally well is recognizing when help defenders collapse into the paint. Rather than forcing difficult layups, she's constantly found open shooters with well-timed kicked-out passes. Players like Phoebish, JJ, and Achu have benefited tremendously from her vision. She doesn't panic when the lane gets crowded. She keeps her dribble alive. She stays patient. And more often than not, she makes the correct read. And that's a very mature quality for a rookie adapting to a new league. Now, of course, no player is perfect. There are still areas where Pauline can continue developing. One thing I'd like to see improve is her ability to find the roller in pick and roll situations. That's probably the area where Sabrina still separates herself. Sabrina Ionescu has an elite ability to manipulate defenses with her eyes before threading passes through incredibly tight windows. Very few guards in the league see those passing angles as quickly as she does. There's been several possessions where Pauline has come off a screen and chosen the safer pass instead of finding the rolling big. Those reads often come with experience. The more chemistry she develops with players like JJ and Stewie, the easier those passes will become. Another area is foul discipline. Pauline plays with tremendous intensity defensively, and that's something you never want to take away from her. But there's been moments where that aggressiveness has resulted in unnecessary fouls. With the WNBA placing greater emphasis on freedom of movement this season, officials have been much quicker to whistle defenders for hand checking and excessive contact on the perimeter. That's an adjustment every defender in the league has had to make. Overall, though, I don't think the Liberty could have asked for much more from Pauline Astier. Considering how long Sabrina was unavailable, Pauline gave New York exactly what it needed: stability, pace, intelligence, and confidence at the point guard position. She hasn't tried to be Sabrina, she simply played her own game, and that's been more than enough to help keep this team moving forward. Now let's move on to Marine Johannes because she's probably the most polarizing player on this Liberty roster. When it comes to fan discussion, there never seems to be much middle ground. On one side, you have the fan who love the creativity, the spectacular passes, and the deep three-pointers that only Marine seems capable of making. On the other side, you have fans who point to her defensive limitations and the stretches where she could seemingly disappear offensively after a strong start. Personally, I think we know exactly who Marion is at this point of her career. That's why I'm always a little surprised when people overreact after either a great game or a bad one. She's always been a high risk, high reward player. The difference this season is that DeMarco has done a much better job putting her in situations where her strengths are maximized. With so many injuries early in the season, Leonie Fibish missing time, Benaja Laney Hamilton working her way back, and Sabrina Ionescu sideline, Marine's role became much more important than originally expected, and overall, I think she's responded very well. Continuing with Marine Johannes, I think one thing we've learned over the years is that you could almost predict the kind of night she's going to have within the first few minutes of a game. If she knocks down one or two free early in the game, you could almost feel her confidence grow possessions after possession. That's when Marine becomes incredibly dangerous. She starts playing freely, making spectacular passes, pushing the pace, and giving the Liberty an offensive spark that very few players in this league can provide. Statistically, I think she's done exactly what New York needed from her. She's averaging around 10 points per game, nearly 3 assists, close to 3 rebounds, and almost a steal per game. Those are excellent numbers for someone who wasn't expected to spend such a long stretch in the starting lineup. Ultimately, once Sabrina Ionescu returned and everyone got healthy, nobody expected Marine to remain a permanent starter. Her value has always been as an offensive weapon coming off the bench. She changes the tempo of a game. She stretches defenses with her shooting range. She creates offense in ways that very few players can. That's exactly the role I expect her to settle back into as the season progresses. That being said, if you're someone who's been critical of Marine Johannes, the recent game against the Seattle Storm probably reinforced many of your concerns. In my opinion, it was one of the weakest performances of the season. It also highlighted the two sides of Marine's game that Liberty fans have debated for years. Offensively, her shot simply wasn't falling, especially during the first half. When that happens, she sometimes starts overthinking instead of trusting her instincts. There were several possessions where she drove into the lane, left her feet expecting to finish at the basket, then changed her mind mid-air and attempted a difficult pass. Those kind of decisions usually lead to turnovers, and that's exactly what happened. I think there were 3 consecutive possessions where she turned the ball over trying to force plays that simply weren't there. Defensively, she also struggled. Whether the Liberty were playing man-to-man or in their 2-free zone, she looked a step behind the action at times. Those are the games where you see Marine most frustrating. When things start going against her offensively, you could almost sense the frustration building. Sometimes that frustration carries over into the defensive end, and occasionally it results in unnecessary frustration fouls after a turnover. Those are the little moments I'll still like to see her eliminate from a game. Overall, though, I still think the positive outweigh the negatives. She brings something to this Liberty offense that very few players can replicate. The key is simply making sure she's put in situations where her strengths are maximized. Another player who deserves a lot of praise during this stretch is Jonquel Jones. To me, it finally feels like we're seeing the Jonquel Jones we watched during the 2024 championship run. After a somewhat slow start to the season, which was understandable given the recovery from off-season ankle surgery, she finally looks healthy again. When Jonquel is healthy, she's one of the most complete centers in basketball. Her rebounding has improved dramatically. She's controlling the glass on both ends of the floor. Her three-point shot has become much more consistent after a difficult start to the season. And what makes her such a nightmare to defend is her versatility. Very few centers can do everything that she does offensively. She can score with a back to the basket, she can face up from the perimeter, she can attack off the dribble, she can knock down three pointers, she can facilitate from the high post. That versatility forces opposing defenses into impossible decisions. If you guard her with a traditional center, she'll stretch you out to the perimeter. If you switch a smaller defender into her, she'll punish the mismatch inside. That's why she's such a unique player. There's also a statistic that Liberty fans know very well. When Jonquel Jones records a double-double, the Liberty almost always win. It's not just because of the numbers themselves. It's because a productive Jonquel Jones usually means the Liberty are controlling the paint, winning the rebounding battle, and playing through one of their biggest matchup advantages. For me, her and Brianna Stewart have clearly been the Liberty's two best players so far this season. And if she continues playing at this level, I absolutely think she deserves an All-Star selection. One thing that surprised me recently was seeing some Liberty fans already questioning Chris DeMarco's coaching. I understand where some of those concerns come from. When you replace Andy Brandello, a coach who became the winningest coach in franchise history and led the Liberty to a championship, you naturally raise expectations. On top of that, Chris DeMarco came from the NBA after spending years with the Golden State Warriors. I'm sure bringing him to New York wasn't cheap. Whether or not he was one of the highest paid coaches in the W, expectations were always going to be extremely high. So I understand why fans expect immediate improvement. But personally, I think he's done a very good job considering the circumstances. Remember, this team has dealt with injuries almost from the opening week of the season. Sabrina Ionescu missed significant time. Lenny Fibish missed games. Benajelani Hamilton has been working her way back. JJ wasn't fully healthy at the beginning of the season. Satu Sabali has missed time. Despite all of that, the Liberty still put together an 8-game winning streak. That's not something you accomplish by accident. The biggest improvement, in my opinion, has been the offensive variety. The Liberty moved the basketball much better than they did last season. There's more cutting, more off-ball movement, more screening actions, more creativity. You can clearly see some of the concept Chris DeMarco brought over from his years with the Golden State Warriors. When you have versatile front-court players like JJ, Stewie, Fibish, and Satu Sabali, it makes perfect sense to build an offense around movement and decision-making rather than isolation basketball. I also love the fact that he's willing to experiment defensively. The full court press, the half court pressure, the 2-3 zone. These aren't defensive schemes we regularly see in today's WNBA. By constantly changing defensive looks, the Liberty force opponents to think instead of simply running the same offensive actions every possession. Against teams like Connecticut or Washington, who aren't elite three-point shooting teams, the zone becomes extremely effective. Against teams with elite ball handlers like Indiana or Atlanta, increasing full court pressure forces players like Caitlin Clark or Jordan Canada to work much harder just to initiate the offense. By the time they cross half court, they've already burned 8 to 9 seconds off the shot clock. That completely changes the rhythm of a possession. And for me, that's smart coaching. It's proactive rather than reactive. Chris DeMarco isn't simply asking his players to defend harder, he's giving them different tools to succeed depending on the opponent. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why this Liberty team has looked much more adaptable during this stretch. Now, with all that being said, that doesn't mean Chris DeMarco has been perfect. There are definitely areas where I think he can improve, and I understand why some Liberty fans have raised questions. The biggest one for me has been his rotations. There's been several games where some of the lineup combinations simply haven't worked, particularly on the defensive end. Sometimes you have Marine Johannes and Sabrina Ionescu sharing the backcourt, and while that's obviously a very talented offensive pairing, it can create some defensive mismatches against bigger or more physical guards. There have also been stretches where DeMarco has gone with units made up almost entirely of role players. Individually, those players are all capable of contributing. In fact, I think the Liberty have one of the deepest rosters in the league. But basketball isn't just about talent, it's about chemistry. Some players naturally complement each other, while others don't. There's been possessions where you can immediately feel the offense become stagnant. The ball stops moving, spacing disappears, and suddenly you're seeing rush shots, turnovers, or even shot clock violations. That's where I think some of the frustration from fans come from. The Liberty have enough evidence now to know which combinations work best together. So instead of constantly experimenting, I'd like to see a little more consistency in some of those rotations. That doesn't mean you stop experimenting altogether. It's a long season, and you need to know what your options are. But when you find groups that consistently produce positive results, I think you have to trust them. The best example of this came in the loss to the Los Angeles Sparks. The Liberty were comfortably ahead, then late in the second quarter and throughout the third, everything completely unraveled. The offense became stagnant, turnovers started piling up, the defensive intensity dropped, and before long, a double-digit lead had completely disappeared. As a coach, those are the moments where you have to recognize what's happening as quickly as possible. Sometimes that means calling a timeout before the momentum completely swings. Other times, it means making an immediate substitution. I felt there were moments during that game where Chris DeMarco waited just a little too long before making those adjustments. Momentum is everything in basketball. Once a team starts believing it can come back, the game changes very quickly. Those are the situations where I like to see him become a little more proactive. Another small criticism I have is the frequency of substitutions. At times, players barely have enough time to settle into the game before they're taken back out. Personally, I prefer giving players a chance to establish some rhythm. Obviously, every player is different, but constantly rotating can sometimes make it difficult for a lineup to build chemistry. One player I continue to wonder about is Raquel Carrera. Out of all the decisions Chris DeMarco has made this season, this is probably the one I understand the least. Raquel arrived in New York after a tremendous season with Valencia basketball, where she helped lead the club to the Spanish League title and was named Finals MVP. She's a high IQ player. She's physical. She's an excellent rebounder. She defends multiple positions. She brings energy every time she steps on the floor. When you look at the Liberty's roster, those are qualities that should be incredibly valuable. So it's been surprising to see how little she has played so far. Now, to be fair, there are factors we don't know. She's adapting to a new country, a new league, a new language, a new coaching staff, a completely different style of basketball. All of those things matter. But players with Raquel's basketball IQ usually adapt fairly quickly. There have been several games where I genuinely thought she could have helped the Liberty, particularly when they needed more physicality or rebounding. Instead, she has often received only a few minutes or entered the game once the outcome had already been decided. Whenever Chris DeMarco has been asked about her role, he has generally been fairly vague. Maybe there are things happening behind the scenes that we simply don't know. That's entirely possible. But based only on what we've seen on the court, I think she deserves more opportunities. Every time she has received meaningful minutes, she has responded positively. We saw it against Connecticut and against the Seattle Storm. She brought energy, she defended well, she rebounded, she played within herself. Those are exactly the kinds of contributions championship teams need from their bench. So that's definitely something I'll continue watching as the season progresses. For me, though, the biggest question surrounding this team has nothing to do with offensive systems or defensive schemes. It's mentality. We're still having conversation about effort. At this stage of the season, that's concerning. This was one of the biggest talking points throughout last year. For a team with championship aspirations, you shouldn't have to question whether the effort will be there every single night. The perfect example came over the last two games. Against the Las Vegas Aces, I thought the Liberty played one of the most complete games of the season. Along with the win over Atlanta, it was probably the best collective defensive performance from start to finish. The intensity was outstanding. The communication was excellent. Everyone competed. And perhaps most impressively, they made life extremely difficult for Asia Wilson. Holding a player of her caliber to just 16 points while keeping her below 40% shooting is an outstanding defensive achievement. Of course, you don't stop Asia Wilson with just one player. It takes everyone. When you can throw JJ, Stewie, Phoebish, and Satu Sabalia at her throughout the game, you're forcing her to work on every single possession. That's exactly what happened. The Liberty looked hungry, they looked connected, they looked like a championship team. But then came Seattle, and that's exactly why the following game was so frustrating. How do you go from playing arguably your best game of the season against the defending champions to delivering one of your poorest efforts against the Seattle Storm? That inconsistency is what worries me the most. It wasn't about missing shots, it wasn't about tactics, it was about energy. Seattle simply played harder. They attacked the basket relentlessly. They won loose balls. They crashed the offensive glass. They played with greater urgency. Too many times, Liberty defenders challenged a shot, watched the ball in the air, and forgot to box out. One sequence perfectly summed up the game for me. Flauja Johnson missed a corner free, grabbed her own offensive rebound, and scored. That simply cannot happen. Not for a team that's trying to win another championship. Those are effort plays. Those are habits. Those are the little details that separate championship teams from everyone else. I don't care whether you're playing Vegas, Minnesota, Seattle, or Connecticut. The standards has to be the same every single night. Championship teams don't choose when to compete. They compete every game, every possession, every quarter. And that's where I still think this Liberty team has room to grow. Now, to be fair, Seattle does have some exciting young talent. Dominic Malonga is one of the brightest young prospects in the league. Flauja Johnson has been an outstanding addition and already looks like one of the steals of the draft. Natisha Heidemann has given the Storm veteran leadership and experience, and she's a player Liberty fans know very well from her years in Minnesota. So this isn't a team without talent, but even taking that into account, I still believe this was a game the Liberty should have won. That's why I find it so frustrating. The performance reminded me a little too much of last season, when we would occasionally see the Liberty follow a great performance with a puzzling flat one. After the game, JJ addressed exactly that issue. She talked about effort, she talked about energy, she talked about bringing the right mentality every single night, and I appreciated her honesty. But at some point, words have to become actions. We've heard this message before. Last season, players repeatedly spoke about consistency and effort. Sometimes the response came immediately, other times the same problems resurfaced only a few games later. That's why I think the next stretch of games becomes so important. The next game against the Golden State Valkyries is a perfect opportunity to respond. Golden State has already shown what it's capable of. About a month ago, they came into New York and completely disrupted the Liberty with their physical defense and relentless energy. Now, the Liberty have to play the Golden State Valkyries on their home floor, where they've been a very difficult team to beat. And if Jedge's message after the Seattle game truly resonated inside that locker room, this is where we'll see it. Because adversity reveals character. Talent has never been the question with this team. Character and consistency are. Can the Liberty respond after a disappointing performance? Can they match Golden State's physicality? Can they maintain their defensive intensity for 40 minutes? Those are the questions I want answered. Personally, I would love nothing more than to be proven wrong. If the Liberty come out with the same intensity they showed against Vegas, I think they're more than capable of winning that game, but they'll have to earn it. And the schedule certainly doesn't get any easier. After returning from California, the Liberty will have very little time to recover before hosting the Las Vegas Aces in the Commissioner's Cup final. On paper, I still like this matchup for New York. The Liberty show in Vegas that they can defend the Aces at a very high level. Their size, versatility, and defensive depth created all kinds of problems for Las Vegas. But expecting the same game would be a mistake. Becky Hammond is one of the best coaches in basketball. She's going to study that previous matchup. She's going to make adjustments. The Aces will most certainly arrive with a different game plan. On top of that, this isn't just another regular season game. There's a trophy on the line, there's prize money on the line. The intensity will naturally be much higher. I expect a much closer and much more physical basketball game than the first meeting. And even after the Commissioner's Cup final, the Liberty won't have much time to breathe. Minnesota remains one of the biggest championship contenders in the league, and New York will face the Lynx twice. Dallas also continues to improve. Toronto has started building momentum behind Marina Mabry and has become a much tougher opponent than many expected earlier in the season. That next stretch could tell us a lot about who the Liberty really are. Now, to be fair, the Liberty haven't had the luxury of a fully healthy roster for very long this season. Sabrina Ionescu missed significant time. Satu Sabali entered concussion protocol just as she was beginning to find a rhythm. Stewie didn't play the last game to manage her workload. Benajelini is still working her way back after missing essentially an entire season, and she's also had to deal with personal matters early in the year. Those are legitimate challenges, there's no question about it, but every team deals with injuries. Every championship contender faces adversity over the course of a season. At some point, you cannot continue using injuries as the primary explanation. Culture has to carry you through those difficult moments. If your habits are strong, if your defensive principles are solid, if everyone understands their role, then regardless of who's available on a given night, the identity of the team should remain the same. That's what separates great teams from championship teams, and I think that's where the Liberty are still searching for greater consistency. Overall, though, I remain optimistic. This team has too much talent not to compete for another championship. Chris DeMarco has introduced fresh ideas on both ends of the floor. The offense has become far more dynamic. The defense has shown it can be incredibly disruptive when everyone is fully committed. Players like Pauline Astier have exceeded expectations. JJ looks like she's returned to championship form. Stewie continues to be one of the best players in the world. There are a lot more positives than negatives. The challenge now is consistency. Can the Liberty bring the same focus, the same discipline, and the same effort every single night? If they can, I genuinely believe this team has everything it takes to compete for another title. But those habits have to start now. You cannot wait until September or October to suddenly decide to become a championship team. Championship habits are built in June, July, and August, and that's what I'll be watching over the next few weeks. That concludes today's episode. I'll be back after the game against the Golden State Valkyries to break down everything we saw, and of course, we'll also have full coverage of the Commissioner's Cup final against the Las Vegas Aces. Before I go, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who's continued supporting Liberty FM while we've been away. We know it's been a little while since our last episode, and we really appreciate your patience and your continued support. It means a lot to us. There's going to be plenty more basketball to talk about as the season continues, and we're excited to be back behind the microphone. Until next time, and as we always say, let's go Liberty!